Order. I call to order today's House of Commons Defence Committee evidence session. It's a one-off evidence session on the future of warfare. And I'm very, very pleased that we have a very eminent, distinguished panel in front of us today. And I am very, very grateful, first of all, to Dr. Keith Dear, CEO and founder of Cassi. Cassi, brilliant. Thank you for taking the time to give evidence today. And it's wonderful also to welcome back Air Marshal retired Edward Stringer. I thank you also, Air Marshal, for your private evidence session that you gave earlier to us. And obviously, as a senior fellow of the Policy Exchange, we're looking forward to your contributions. And it's also wonderful to have with us Sir Hugh Strachan, who is a Wardlaw Professor of International Relations at the University of St Andrews. Gents, well, let me kickstart proceedings with yourself, Air Marshal, with regards to the wider strategic context. Obviously, there's been a lot happening in terms of warfare, but can you set out briefly the key trends and relationships shaping the future of warfare? And also, if you could, once you've done that, talk about the future of an international legal framework as well.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the committee for giving us all the opportunity to come and give evidence this morning. I think to answer your question, I'll counter very quickly through three background factors, which I think we've all, in one way or another, been writing about for at least the last 10 years, but which I think some of it has only really become salient in the last couple. So I'd start off by saying, in the geostrategic backdrop, the geopolitics, is convergence of three events. Climate change, which is a once in, we've never dealt with it before. The rise of China and the shift in economic power to the east, and with economic power comes political power and the ability to invest in military power, and that's probably a once in 500-year event. Given 500 years ago was the rise of the West in Europe and the centricity of that. And then you have the merger now of what are sometimes called the fourth and fifth industrial revolutions. These things are all interrelated. So the fourth industrial revolution is a move from the industrial age to the information age, the digital age. And the fifth is largely a result of climate change, moving to sustainable energy economy, and therefore moving beyond the era where all economies were hydrocarbon centric. And of course those two are sort of emerged in the sense of the high-tech era that we are living in at the moment. What does that mean for the military? Well, I would say that military power always follows the Industrial Revolution. So if it's 150 years ago that we had the first industrial age war, which was the American Civil War, and since then we've had wars of industrial production, wars of the railroad, the factory, the telegraph. All that revolutionised the way that armies and nations, it revolutionised the way armies fought, it revolutionised the way that nations went to war. So now we're through the fourth and fifth industrial revolution, we're going to see a change in the way that armies fight and the way that nations go to war. And I could just simplify that by picking on four technologies. Without getting into detail.
Marshal, I think some commentators have highlighted that we might have a return to state-on-state conflict, or do you feel that it's more nuanced than that in terms of the use of proxies or things happening in the grey zone sub-threshold?
It's a bit of all of those. Right. But against this backdrop, it's the way that those states are manipulating this that matters and shapes how we must respond as a nation state and with our alliances. I mean, very briefly on that, how those fourth and fifth industrial revolutions coming together. You've got enhanced connectivity now. We're all used to it in our state. So if I could just say, the battlefield cloud, that allows data and associated machine learning to be there at the present at the edge in our warfighting capacities. That allows artificial intelligence to do things that were previously only science fiction, and that allows autonomous systems to come to the fore as well. Now, all of those are reshaping what we have termed, and I say nearly 10 years ago, the economics of lethality. In the industrial age, we built big industrial platforms, submarines, fighter aircraft. All the technology was in the platform. Now we have smart warheads, you have swarming warheads, you have swarming weapons. They cost a lot less than the platforms. So the economics of lethality. And then, to reference what you've just said, yes, we're back from that slight holiday from history from 1989. And as I said, the rise in China, suddenly the West is facing a competitor it hasn't seen for 500 years. And I don't need to, this audience knows exactly what I mean by that.
Into China later on as well. My request to all the panellists is we've got to try to be as concise as possible because there's a lot of ground to cover, and we do want to get your views from all three of yourselves on most of these areas. We want to get all of yourselves to give a short, concise the contribution so that we can then move on to the next topic as well. So Hugh, I want to come to yourself. What do you think are the key trends and relationships which are shaping the future of warfare? You've obviously studied as an eminent academic into many of these things, and also if you could perhaps speak to us about a future of an international legal framework with regards to these trends as well.
Very quickly on the first point, I would simply refine what Ed said by saying, and this comes out of the Changing Character War programme, which I set up and ran at Oxford for more than 10 years, is you need to recognise old trends continue alongside new. It's not all new, and the tendency always is to be led by the new technology. Yep. Not that the new technology is not important, it is, but some of the changes can be changed back rather than change forward, and some of the changes too have to accommodate existing platforms. No armed forces start with a tabula rasa of totally new equipment reflecting the state of the art. To cut to your point about the international legal order, it does seem to me that, and this is hardly news given what's happened in the last 12 months, that the post-1945 international legal order has collapsed to all intents and purposes. It's not been helped by our own participation in something called the rules-based international order, which seems to me a profoundly unhelpful label. It locks people into an idea of a US-dominated world. It does not appeal to the global south. It doesn't make sense of what is going on. And we've got a crisis, it seems to me, in the relationship within law, within the relationship between the decision to go to war and how you actually fight a war. In the history of international law since the 18th century, those two things have been treated separately. Yeah. Now we have a situation where we see a thoroughly justified Ukraine in terms of fighting a war of national self-defense against an aggressor. We have accumulated evidence of Russian war crimes. I think there are about 150,000 cases, at least as long ago as a year ago, stored in the cloud as far as Ukraine is concerned. Yeah. There is no hope of dealing with that number of cases in a legal system. And the consequence is that the question of Russian responsibility at individual soldier level for war crimes essentially gets folded into the argument that this is an unjust war in the first place, that Russia should not be fighting. And then we have a flipped argument going on in Gaza, where Israel is seen as thoroughly justified in its response to Hamas. Hamas, of course, is not a state actor, so from that point of view, it's outside the UN Charter framework. But Hamas clearly launched an attack which would be seen in UN terms as a breach of the Charter if it were a state actor, but then a disproportionate response in terms of the conduct of war. So this matters, it seems to me, enormously for the United Kingdom, because we have positioned ourselves as a middle-rank power, as one that is ready to defend and to depend on the international legal structure that we have created. That is what gives us influence. We need to address how we can actually put that back into shape. And at the moment, we're not addressing it. And I would just say, I realise you want to get on. I would say very quickly, there are 2 points here. Number one, how do we handle that distinction within international law, between the justification to go to war and how you fight a war legally in terms of its conduct? That is now in tension with each other. It's always been paradoxical. And the second issue is we need actually to enable our armed forces to have political utility. In other words, they need to be able to fight in ways that are legally defensible. And that reintroduces a concept that's been essentially written out of international law, but was very powerful in the 19th and early 20th century, which is this idea of military necessity. It's not just that you need to be justified in fighting the war in the first place, but you need actually to enable your armed forces to do so in ways that are effective if that serves the ultimate objective, which in our understanding would be a defensive struggle.
Thank you, so I think that was a fascinating contribution, and the reason why I've allowed all of yourselves actually to set the scene, because I think it's important that we get those things on record before we then delve into each particular item. Dr. Deer, from your perspective, given the wider strategic context, the question that I've asked regarding the key trends and relationships, what are your thoughts around an international legal framework, as well as how you view the future warfare to be in terms of the use of proxies or things happening in the grey zone? Can you please set the scene with respect to your own academic work on this?
Yeah, I think the first and central theme driving a lot of the urgency in geopolitical competition is the fear of the arrival of artificial general intelligence. Broadly put, there's a tyranny of definitions here, but broadly put, an AI that outperforms most or perhaps all humans in all cognitive domains. Nature magazine this morning, published today, has claimed that AGI has been achieved. It's quite a bold statement, but they've gone so far as to say it has. Now, everything we care about in defence, but also much more widely, is the product of intelligence. Weapons are the product of intelligence. Tactics and strategies are the product of intelligence. If you have access to a smarter model that can give you better tactics, better strategies, better weapons, and so forth, by definition, you are going to have a significant advantage over your adversary. And that's true of competition in the military domain, but it's also true of competition in the economic domain, and it's true of governments as well, much more efficient and effective policies. So with that as backdrop, you see a fierce competition in the US with a very different model, backing the largest AI companies to build the largest possible models with as much money channeled into those models as possible, with the view that perhaps there's a winner-takes-all outcome here, where you just have that smarter model, you nationalise it. The US presidential memo for AI under President Biden has a clause for them to nationalise any AI company that gets to AGI, which I think is super interesting. In China, you have a fear of, well, what would it mean if the US gets there first and we're locked out? And so their strategy is an AI plus strategy. They're not able to invest at the same rate. They're not innovating at the same rate. And consequently, the majority of their investments are in fast followership. That doesn't look like a bad bet. The open source models they build are 6 to 12 months behind the models that are released from the US. So they are consistently behind, but they're consistently following. So were the US to hit a threshold where they don't go any higher, were there to be a top of the S-curve rather than continuing straight lines on graphs, China could win. And again, then we have a nation that is more effective than us in building weapons, coming up with better tactics, strategies, policies, and so forth. I've only really talked about China and the US because, to be honest, in terms of winning the race, they are the two major players. If we take a UK perspective, I think we have an AI action plan. We have some things that are beginning to address these, but in defence, really, we have a huge, to use Edward's phrase, say-do gap between the profundity with which we talk about the import of AI and the reality of AI deployed within UK defence. And I'm sure we'll come back to that. So for me, the thing that is driving the maniacal competition in energy, for rare earth minerals, and more broadly for economic dominance globally, is this fear of what artificial intelligence will mean militarily, economically, and politically for all of us.
Good, brilliant. Well, that's absolutely fascinating. I just want to get a second question. On this one, I will get views from all three of yourselves because I want to get things on the record, but if we could be fairly concise with this, and it's something that you've mentioned in terms of our closest ally, the US. Now, we've all seen the US's the new administration, that they've changed course with the new national security strategy, the defense strategy. What do you think are the implications of that? And do you think, in your esteemed opinion, that UK defence is planning for a future with less cooperation with the US, or do you think that that won't be the case? So Hugh?
I think there is much more ambiguity in the national security strategy and in the national defence strategy of the US than we've read, the press in particular has read into it. For me, from the UK point of view, the crucial points are, first of all, we're not separately mentioned. We're part of Europe.
Yeah.
And furthermore, they see us as, I mean, to use the vocabulary of the defence strategy, we must become partners, not dependents. So the drive is there. If we react to that challenge, then the implication will be seen as good boys or girls in the eyes of the United States. It's not, in other words, a closed door, is how I read it. The other point I would make is the issue to do with extended deterrence within that. There's no statement in the defence strategy, or in fact the whole defence strategy is extraordinarily thin on actual capabilities as opposed to statements of intent. But there is no reference there to extended deterrence. The strong stress is on deterrence by denial, which is exactly what got us into problems in relation to Ukraine. A reluctance to use deterrence through the threat of escalation, which might actually have deterred Russia, or at least would have met Russia on its own terms. Those seem to me the principal takeaways. I mean, for the UK, what I conclude from that is that actually the Indo-Pacific, as far as the United States is concerned, is not an area of interest for European powers or a concern for European powers. There is no reference to that. There's a lot of reference to allies in the region. Not actually, barely. I don't think there's a reference to Australia, despite AUKUS, but reference obviously to South Korea, Japan, and the immediate neighbours. So I take this, with this administration, to be dogmatic about the future is clearly difficult. But as the document is written, and what is interesting, I think, about both documents, is that alongside all the sort of praise of Trump and his sort of single-handed driving of all this, which, of course, you can dispense with, what is really striking is the clarity of expression and the directness. To imagine the UK, let alone a former US administration, writing documents that spoke so simply and clearly and reference old concepts in ways that Americans can understand, the Monroe Doctrine being the obvious one, is for us extraordinary. We would struggle to write a strategy that was that clear and that simple. And yet that, of course, is precisely why it will have power.
Well, it does definitely make for very sobering reading. Dr. Deb, very briefly, what are your views and the implications of the US national security strategy and the defence strategy?
So I think they're a continuation, and in one case explicitly, of a Hamiltonian and mercantilist view of the world in terms of competing continuously for relative power with your allies as much as with your adversaries. I think you see an element of McKinley in the talk around Greenland, so a back to the future, as it were, in terms of the acquisition of territory and dominance over those territories. I think the UK is not prepared to compete in that world, and I think we should also look really closely at what the US says in both its national security strategy and its national defence strategy, and then ask a deeper question of why it says it. Yeah. So specifically, they talk about how the Indo-Pacific region will be half of the global economy. There's a reason why they would like us to be less active in the Indo-Pacific. There is a relationship between your military cooperation and your ability to secure the kind of economic collaboration and cooperation that we need. The world's largest middle class is going to be in the Indo-Pacific. And if you move to a much more automated economy, well, yes, you can produce goods now independent, or at least with reduced dependence on demography, vastly decreased dependence. But in the end, robots don't buy goods and they don't pay taxes. And so where are you going to sell those things to? Well, it's going to be to where the economy is growing the fastest and where the population is growing the fastest, and that's the Indo-Pacific. So I think we should be really careful before we assume that some of the things we're being asked to do in terms of burden sharing in Europe is purely about fairness as opposed to about dominance and relative power in the international system.
Right. Well, that is, I think very, very thought-provoking indeed. Marshal, briefly from yourself, what are your thoughts? Will we be able to rely on our US ally going forward, or are we looking at less cooperation?
We have to buy a seat at the table. And what the national security strategy says to me, and you look at the way it's rowed back its description of China. China is now just another competitor in science and technology, the sort of economic battle that Keith mentioned, and in fact as part of the writing team for the integrated review he referenced a couple of years ago. And so if we want to be taken seriously, we have to compete in that battle. That means we have to understand the risk, that we're taking here. And we have seen this before. You're talking about, do things change? In 1945, remember, we were thrown out of the nuclear program by our ally America after we put all of the Maud committee's great intellectual property into it. Well, the Attlee-Bevan decided, right, we're going to have a bomb, we're going to have a bloody Union Jack on top of it. We need to compete, we need to fight, we need to take risk, we need to invest in all of these technologies, at which point America will see us as a player. At the moment, you could argue, we are now where they are having the proxy battle. China is supporting Russia to fight Ukraine in Europe. And I'll finish by saying I was in Berlin just before Christmas, and it has really shocked the Germans. The 28-point peace plan, suddenly the security architecture of Europe is being decided, and Europeans are not invited into the room. We have to fight, we have to compete. America is still a democracy, it's still a natural ally, but we have to approach it from a position of strength, and we have to be able to negotiate in a hard-headed way.
Good. I believe my colleague Jesse Norman has a quick supplementary on this.
Thank you all very much for those contributions. It's a very simple, just framework question, which is, on a scale of what's come through overwhelmingly from what you said is how remarkably unserious we are facing the challenges in front of us and the nature of the escalating defence and security context. Without being too crass about it, could you just give me a sense, by scoring the UK seriousness between 1 and 10, just in the face of it, just give me some sense. Are we a 2, a 3, or are we a 7 or 8? Where are you each coming from in terms of our seriousness in responding to this challenge? Because the say-do gap that Ed's talked about is one that strikes a very deep chord. So I just want to know if it strikes a chord with you guys.
Well, I put UK at the bottom end. I mean, the Strategic Defence Review takes most of this pretty seriously, but where has it landed?
Where's the money? But in terms of actual doing things.
Well, we need to do, it's about, this is, of course, like any academic hedging, a response to a straight question. But if you look at when we could possibly deliver seriously, it wouldn't be after till 2030 or even 2035. And that's assuming we do everything we've committed ourselves to doing. What could we do in 2026 or 2027? Almost nothing. And so there is an enormous immediate gap, quite apart from the long term. And most of the responses about seriousness are long term. And of course, they're felt in only certain sectors of government. And this is a national question, not a sector of government question.
Okay, great. Maybe Dr. Deere, you next. I think we probably know where Ed's coming from.
I think you have to look at these in different ways. So I will put a number on it. I think if you took the Strategic Defence Review and you were explicit in saying some of those things would need developing, but how likely is it that we will have implemented the things that are listed in there by, say, 2030? I would say 3 out of 10 on your framework, about a 30% probability that we will have implemented those things in a way that everybody would accept, or a reasonable observer would accept that we had. I think you can see that in the way the MOD is talking about private capital, for example. You don't have to persuade private capital to invest if they believe there's a return there. And I think you see from a real live actual market, which accurately represents, or more accurately represents bets on the future, what different people around defence think of the likelihood of the UK investing. I think to be slightly fairer to UK defence and the UK more broadly, if it was about how seriously they're taking the threat within the resources they have and what they can do today, as opposed to the honest arguments for how likely they are to achieve the future, then that would probably go up. I think there is a recognition that we face an urgent threat, but actually doing something about it and the likelihood of achieving those things, that's where my probabilities are much lower.
Sean, Ed.
Well, it's interesting we both plumped at 3 out of 10, but I'd say you've got to split the UK up a little bit. Because we do have some extremely good AI companies. When you talk to industry, it's massively frustrated. I think the problem is we still have a reluctant big machine in Whitehall that's still trying to force this new world into the old processes and hope to carry on muddling through. Given what we've all said about risk and the speed of change, you need a big transformation. Dare I say it, you need a sort of Haldane 1906 moment, and that has to be driven politically with some real political clout behind it. And until you get that change, I don't think any more money being thrown into defence is going to necessarily be spent wisely until you do that change. So you've got to get that change done, and it's got to be driven with a real sense of political.
You're definitely in the 3 out of 10 type area.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. As around here, as collectively the nation state, the machinery of government is approaching it.
Okay,
Thank you very much. Right, Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning all, thanks for being with us. I'm going to ask about China and Russia and potential collaboration, how close they might be getting in the future, whether we can ever likely to see a kind of combined force fielded, what you think has happened already in Ukraine in that space, whether it's tech or personnel. And the context of this, obviously, Russia is war experienced, modern warfare experienced in a way that other countries are not. And China is churning out military capabilities at a kind of astonishing rate, be that from kind of space to maritime capabilities, and obviously personnel-wise, they are in a different position to most other countries. If I could come to Ed, to yourself first, please.
I've just come back from Ukraine, and they will point out that Chinese now have just discreetly built literal supply lines, railway lines that go to drone factories in Russia. Open source suggests that 60% of the Russian effort is being covertly bankrolled by China. So even though there's no ideological alliance...
Sorry, just say that last stat again?
It's about 60% of keeping the Russian war effort and economy going. So there's a huge amount of support from China. It's just not in weaponry with a Chinese flag on it. But there's a huge amount of support to Russia, and Russia can only maintain this war because China is essentially bankrolling it. And that's because it's in China's interests to keep the West and America distracted in supporting this. So Russia is useful to it at the moment. If you look at the weapons tech, there's been an inversion there as well. So the previous generation, if you looked at Chinese aircraft, Chinese ships, they're copies of the Russian ones. That's not the case now. And the stuff that is now being developed, the latest generation of Chinese warships, of Chinese aircraft, is their own manufacture. I mean, a lot of it, obviously, there's been a lot of intellectual property theft from the West. But the boot is on the other foot. And at the moment, Russia is very useful to China, as a distraction, keeping the West tied up. I'll finish on that and hand over to the other panellists, if you don't mind.
Thank you. In 2018, I wrote for the Rusi Journal in response to Putin's statement that whoever leads in AI will rule the world, was Putin's hyperbolic statement at the time. Well, I think increasingly it looks like that is going to be true. And I said then that Russia is weak and weakening in technology. Its technical talent is leaving. Its educational system, once like the pride of the world, is also weakening. I think the chances of it leading in those kind of emerging technologies is only diminishing and diminishing faster since the start of the Ukraine conflict. And what that means is a growing dependency on China. So it is absolutely useful for China to keep the West occupied in Ukraine. It's also quite useful for China to keep Russia occupied in Ukraine because it's increasing its tech and economic dependency and therefore increasing its influence over it, reducing the threat that it might face from the north and enabling it to increasingly leverage Russia should it need to. So it puts Russia in a position of greater dependency. I think therefore alliances are likely, but they're not going to be anything like equal partnerships, and I think that is in part what drives the US's view that maybe it can prise Russia away from China in the medium to long term. Now, whether that's right or not is a separate question which I'm happy to tackle, but I think what you're seeing is that ever-growing dependency, and the question is how far Russia is willing to accept that growing dependency, economic and technological.
It's very interesting that the kind of picture from answer to my question and from previous questions is that because Europe, including the UK, are falling so far behind on AI and some other tech advancements and on spending power, that it kind of feels in a way, and you haven't said this exactly, that Ukraine-Russia war is becoming like a proxy war between the USA and a China-backed Russia. But you guys haven't said that, but it's an interesting kind of theme. But yeah, over to you.
Yes, I don't know if I think proxy war becomes an unfortunate label because you don't get into the nuance of what's going on. But I would, just to row back, I mean, the logical argument's always been that Russia and China will fall apart at some point and you need to exploit that. The trouble is that China at the moment doesn't seem to want to have a conversation with Washington, at least under the previous administration. Efforts to use the moment created by the war in Ukraine to have that conversation were not being responded to from the Chinese end. Whether Trump can be more successful in that domain seems still very much an open question. I think what I would say is that from the point of view of the war in Ukraine, what I don't see is any desire on China's part for this war to escalate. I mean, it was very clear at the beginning when it responded to Russian nuclear threats to say that's not the line you're going down. That what it's in other words, that reinforces the argument that it suits China to have this war ongoing, and Russian dependency adds to that. I suppose the other point I would make about this relationship is that this is a sort of very Mackinderite geopolitical point, but you now have a bloc with Russia, China, Iran in the mix too, geographically contiguous, with extraordinary leverage from that position in what Mackinder would have called Eurasia, with a capacity, and Ed's point about railway lines makes the point, with capacity to communicate easily enough if the investment is made, and that extends into the Stans as well potentially. So, how you disaggregate those states as opposed to encourage them to work together is probably not within our gift in terms of our own power. Is in the power possibly of the United States, but even it, and there is a point here in the National Defence Strategy where it talks about, and why I use Mackinder deliberately, it talks about the US and its allies, this is a sign of potential leverage, being on the periphery of this bloc, all round it, and therefore having a degree of at least power over trade, power over what happens.
And do we think if there is a ceasefire in Ukraine in the next year or two, that China would be encouraging Russia in some way to take further invasive action somewhere else in a NATO border, be it Finland or Estonia? Would that be in China's interest then?
I think China's more candid than that, is my sense, is that it would see where the opportunities lie. Ukraine was an opportunity. China didn't instigate Russia's attack on Ukraine, but what it's done is enable its continuation and its over a protracted period.
Saying if there was a ceasefire, would they be kind of encouraging?
I don't. Well, I think the answer is if it continues to result in cheap Russian oil coming into China, then possibly it would have an incentive to do this.
Very quick answers on that question from the other two.
I don't think you'd want to foment a conflict, but it would be very happy to see Europe tied up spending a lot of its GDP on defence against something that looks like a frozen conflict around Ukraine, Belarus, etc., etc.
I think the same. I think it's unlikely it would actively advocate for an invasion or a direct, but the idea that it would want Russia to be just as concerned about the European threat and therefore spending and focusing its war economy west rather than south and east, I think that would be true. It's not the same as saying I think it would be actively trying to precipitate an invasion or a direct hot war.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. On to Calvin Bailey.
Thanks, Chair. So on to defence reform. Marshal, you've written quite a powerful piece about the say-do gap, which focuses on defence reform and some of its initiatives. And we had a report from this committee, It Is Broke and It's Time to Fix It, which speaks about defence procurement and the political imperative, in the words of the report, that is necessary to translate our ambition and limited resource into some impact. We heard that defence reform would be the biggest obstacle to a successful SDR delivery. So can I ask, can we start by hearing from you about what initiatives, which initiatives from defence reform show any sign or promise of addressing the say-do gap or the challenges that are put to us in the It's Broke and It's Time to Fix It?
I'll address very briefly, Chair, the two I mentioned. And the whole point of defence reform was to make named individuals accountable for actual outcomes rather than there just being over the road there a bum fight over managing resource and therefore inputs. And so one area which is useful, given we're talking now about state-on-state conflict, we're talking about serious prolonged war. In any war, your reserve forces are vital. And it is interesting that the reserve forces in the UK are reporting they're suddenly being taken seriously because now they're run by the operational output side of the Ministry of Defence. They're not just seen as an HR or personnel question to be run under the area of Chief of Defence People. Ditto, military strategy and ops is now no longer just managing the current operations around the globe through PGHQ, but thinking about the sort of questions that we've discussed this morning. However, what I would say is the big fiefdoms of the old model are still there. The big fiefdom of finance and military capability, the military strat and ops, and the Chief of Defence People's area. And it has not yet turned into a properly military strategic headquarters that is looking at the actual outputs and therefore taking the three services properly under command. And I think you're seeing that at the moment in the inter-service horse trading over what the defence investment plan looks like, which seems to me like the chiefs behaving just as they have before, without a military strategic headquarters dictating what the vital outputs and actual outcomes are to be achieved. And without that, the reform of having a National Armaments Director means the National Armaments Director and his staff can't start making the really hard-nosed decisions that would be necessary to get us through and demonstrate, not least to the Treasury, that the MOD is reforming its procurement practices. So, we talked before about are we taking this seriously? I think this is an example where we still have too much business as usual. And without that, it's going to be hard for the Secretary of State to make the case to the Treasury that more money will be properly spent and will be delivered in actual outcomes. I think the Treasury have a point if they said this is probably going to be soaked up and evaporate in the normal way. So I think that is the problem with defence reform at the moment. It's stuck in a halfway house and it hasn't got to the stage yet where you actually have those four individuals actually named, sat round the Defence Board table in front of the Secretary of State, actually responsible for hard outcomes. What is the military posture to do, and is it achieving those outcomes in the strategic context that you mentioned earlier on? National Armaments Director, are we spending money wisely in delivering only the resource that we need rather than that which the services want? And we haven't moved that far yet.
Thank you. And I think Alex Baker is going to come in on some of the methods by which we deliver that output in terms of financing. So we'll come back to you. But last week we were in Barrow. And we heard about how one of the major programmes was being asked for options, which is kind of evidence of that bad behaviour. And we also put to CDS that the fact that the three individual service chiefs had gone out and made their own pitches for the world was absolutely perverse and kind of laughs in the face of defence reform. So you're nodding violently. I was going to come on to Dr.
I'm nodding
Keith,
in agreement without a significant contribution to make, I'm afraid.
Okay, no, that's fine. Then, Dr. Steer?
I think that there are other examples where there is progress, but not enough, I think, which is sort of builds on Edward's point in terms of defence reform. So an example would be the SDR talks about a novel tech ring fencing, moving 10% of the defence budgets into novel technologies every year. We absolutely need that, and it could drive the kind of change we need. But because, as I understand it, there was some resistance to having a definition of what was meant by novel tech, there's a real danger that a lot of things that were already in the pipeline just get relabelled as novel, and then, oh, look, we're doing it. I think when I left, I thought that the MOD system couldn't be reformed from the inside. I haven't changed that view. And I think there are other examples of things that superficially are fantastic, and then you think about them for a bit longer and they're not quite there. So the Defence Industrial Strategy has an accountability table. That's great. We've never had anything like that before, to my knowledge. It then lists people by position rather than by individual name and what they're responsible for. The problem with that is the tenure for most SCS is shorter than anything like any of the programmes, even with the new rules that say they're trying to get from 6 years to 2 years for contract award, not for new capabilities. So from 6 years to 2 years for contract award. Well, most senior civil servants will be gone. Maybe 50% of people have changed roles after 2 years. Maybe there's only 30% left after 3 years. So there is no alignment of incentives and individual accountability, and no one is actually named. I hesitate to say it's a sort of Potemkin effort at accountability, but it isn't quite what it says on the tin, and I think that's a real concern, especially given the necessity of speed in an era where everything is accelerating, which I hope we'll come back to at some point.
Can I just come in with a quick thought? Ed earlier referred to a Haldane 1906 moment, and the historian in me bristled a bit, as it does when Ed makes historical points. but simply to say that, of course, what Haldane was responding to was the need to cut army expenditure in the first instance and prepare it for imperial defence. It was not a great plan to deal with the First World War. And the same applied to the Navy. And that makes a point, essentially, in relation to Keith's argument. You get that from pressure from outside, Haldane coming in with a bunch of fresh ideas, which he put through, not as fully as he wanted, but without a clear vision of what was going to happen, but crucially just to think about how you could be more efficient in the first place. And I think there are elements here where, as you try to construct what is it you're fighting for, which of course you want to do. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. Clearly you need to plan. But actually there are things to do with process and outcomes that stand independently of any scenario building, because the scenario will almost certainly be wrong in its particulars. It might not be wrong in its general indication, but it's likely to be wrong. It could even be wrong in that respect. We prepare for one sort of war and it'll be another sort of war. But if you don't think about how to deliver outcomes quickly, then you're certainly not in a position to be able to respond when the war does come.
Thank you. And there are three of us in the room, Dr. Deere, that believe that this system couldn't get changed from the inside, and that's why three of us are in this room. I'd like to kind of hear more evidence of... I do wonder whether Luke Pollard's response to Ajax and finally seeing an individual accountable is maybe a start in that shift, perhaps, and I see Air Marshal Ed chuckling. Is there perhaps some more examples? Because all I'm seeing at the moment is old behaviours repeating themselves and coming out in many different ways. Without prior to coming on to the money, one of my big concerns is that those behaviours do real lasting damage, and we've got Michel here who can explain how that is the case was in Barrow. But are there any other examples that we should be kind of focusing on or looking at to see?
You're looking for positive or negative examples?
Negative, where we're seeing that defence reform isn't doing what it says. We've had some good examples from Ed at the beginning, Marshal Ed. Are there other things that we should be looking at or focusing on?
Well, I think a laser focus on whether innovation is pulling things across the valley of death. We have never been short of low-cost pilots in multiple new technologies across defence, things that look good on the OJAR and sound good in press releases, but it's hard to see that in the front line in the UK and a meaningful change in how we fight and what we buy to enable how we fight. So I think looking at, in the end, that it's in that outcome, like is the front line changing at the speed at which technology is moving? And I think the answer to that is clearly no, and I think many inside the system would be willing to say exactly the same. So I would keep a laser focus on that.
Is that a willingness to change? Do you see any evidence, Marshal, of a willingness from the people to change? Because I've given the example, I think actually the example I stole from you, but was from some of your writing, but was, those three chiefs, individual service chiefs coming out with individual plans before we move on to the finance.
Yeah, so without getting into where we are currently with the Ajax programme, which is obviously terribly murky and commercially sensitive and all of that, how did we get there in the first place? And also, how's the question being framed? Even now, how is the question of Ajax being framed? I'd argue it's framed as a procurement problem. And go back a couple of years, and the other services and various others would almost have a chuckle and go, that's the Army's problem to solve. But it wasn't. The military strategic headquarters, were it to exist, could not deploy the land component and meet our doctrine and meet our NATO commitments. Mm-hmm. Yet this wasn't the first and foremost conclusion of, around here in the MOD. It was, we have a procurement problem to solve. Now, actually, if you had run this again through, and some people would argue with me over this, but if you run this through, go back 10, 15 years when the programme started, and essentially just go, has the Chief of Defence Staff signed on land component doctrine that says you need a vehicle that looks something that's now being satisfied by Ajax. Yes, right. Go to the market and add what can you get. CV90 looks pretty good, made by a huge amount of British input in that and BAE Systems. It works. There's a load of allies, that's the important thing as well. So the production line behind it will stay. That's perfectly good enough. And then that would shift the army now, not to an organisation that's trying to perfect kit and become a pretty amateur, as all the services are, procurement agency. It's now shifted to being a fighting service. This is what you get given, make the most of it, which actually the services are really good at. Our personnel are really good at making the most of what they're given. So what defence reform will do will shift those priorities. Military Strategic Headquarters says what the priorities are. We can probably all list those now, and it's probably less contentious following what's happened with the United States recently than it has been for a while. We could list those priorities. So these are the military options that need to be done. You hand that kit list over to the NAD, the stuff is given to the services. It inverts the way things work at the moment.
Thank you very much. Alex Baker.
Thank you, Chair. Marshal Strachan, it won't surprise you to find out that I want to ask you about defence finance. So our adversaries are redesigning their financial infrastructure to fight their war, yet our banks struggle to lend defence in the fullest sense that they could. Can you talk a bit about some of the innovative solutions to finance that the UK should be looking at, obviously including the Multilateral Defence Security and Resilience Bank, and maybe you could comment on the news from Friday that Canada are anchoring conversations about the founding of that bank.
The Chair will please know I will be very brief on this because my colleague to the right has got hands-on experience of doing this at the moment. Well, the first thing to say is we're still living in the era of ESG, therefore it is hard to invest in defence. That needs to shift. That could be politically driven from the top. We need to get hold of money, and we need to get hold of money at very good long-term rates. And yes, something like the Defence Security and Resilience Bank, I do believe, is a very good idea for doing that. Our allies and most of the Jeff nations are really keen on this, and for some reason it's actually been London, Westminster, and our officialdom that's pushed back slightly. You'll have to ask them why. I'm told there's a bit of not invented here, but there's also a bit of, that's a funny finance model. We just go to the Treasury gives us money, and we go time and material, and we buy stuff. But it's interesting, isn't it, that Canada has leapt in and said, well, if London, global finance centre, and the British government isn't going to go in, I see an opportunity, and this is an ex-central banker. So if you want a vote of confidence in it, the fact that Mark Carney is behind it, should be it. My final point before handing over to Keith, we talked earlier on, Chair, about how quickly things are moving, that the risk appetite, that we want to now start really being able to compete and turn around to our ally America and go, actually, we're just as big and strong as you are, then this is a small amount of risk to take to provide us with the funding mechanisms to really invest in that science and tech that underpins military power. If we can't even take this amount of risk in going for things like the Defence Security and Resilience Bank, then what sort of strategic shock is going to make us move to a slightly different model? Could I hand over to Keith?
Yeah, I mean, just to add, the Defence Security and Resilience Bank team estimate at the moment our banks can lend £12 for every pound, and they estimate with the credit guarantees that the Defence Security and Resilience Bank could deliver, our banks could lend £30 for every pound. Do you think there's an actual understanding of these defence finance issues within the Treasury and in the MOD?
I think there's a misunderstanding of what drives the capital gap. I think principally the view is if only we had more money that we could pump prime, then suddenly we'd have all these technologies. But the problem is that nobody believes the things that are getting built are going to be bought. There isn't a problem with global liquidity or capital more broadly. I mean, maybe at Series B in the UK because of the broader depth of our market, but not in the early stages for companies like mine. The problem is convincing investors. This was true when I was at a large corporate with a major defence account, arguing for the Global Board for Investment in Technologies we wanted to sell into UK government and defence. It's true now as a startup having those conversations with global investors. They don't believe that the money is going to be there to deliver a return. And so far, that negativity over the last 5 years has been proved right. There isn't massive investment in technology. There aren't contracts coming out. And when those contracts do come out of defence, they come out in sort of penny packeted ways. So I think everything that's going on, I think the Defence and Security Resilience Bank is something that we need. I think this debate is one that we need. But I think there's a misunderstanding of what is meant by demand signals, which seems to be the sort of the term du jour in the MOD. Demand signals are the MOD buying things at a scale that justify private investors putting capital in. And the problem isn't that we can't get the money to invest, it's that in order to convince an investor, you've got to show how you can access other markets, because nobody really buys it. And that's I think that's a market judgment on the likelihood of us getting to 2.7%, 3% and ultimately 5% GDP, and that translating into investments in those kind of emerging technologies at the scale that we all think we need. So I don't know, it makes me slightly sceptical of things like 300 million going to NSIF for defence. The National Security Investment Fund is something that invests in niche technologies where there is no market, absolutely, but there should be a market in the Ministry of Defence as a first customer for some of these defence products, and if there is, there'd be no problem crowding in the capital. So yes, it's a good thing. Is there a problem with a lack of understanding? To some extent, but I think the bigger problem is seeing this as a supply side problem and not a demand side problem.
Could I briefly answer your question about, is this known about? I think it was 2019 in the Defence Strategy Group. This idea was put across the table, because in some of the work I was doing then dealing with dual use companies, they would point out, they would go to JP Morgan and talk about big data and how to, and because they now had a contract with JP Morgan, they go to the markets, and the figure I used, not your 31, I just said 5 to 1. You can get 5 to 1, and the dual use companies are telling us we should be doing this. And there was a sort of, well, that's all very interesting, move on. So there was no spark, there was no, oh, that's interesting, and I still don't think they've grabbed it.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Michelle Scroggum.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask Sir Hugh first on this one. Do you think the UK's posture on deterrence needs to change in light of the shifting ways that warfare's moving?
Well, I think we need to begin by talking about it, which we don't do. I mean, it's not on people's public consciousness. For deterrence to operate, there has to be public ownership. If you're particularly talking at the nuclear level, because you're actually involving the whole of society in the implications of the use of nuclear weapons. And really, ever since the Cold War, we haven't wanted to have that debate. And given the fact that that is the biggest procurement item currently in the defence budget, it is extraordinary we're not having that discussion, or even a public awareness that it is the biggest item in the defence budget. They're focusing much more on the stuff that gets the headlines, which of course is AI, AGI and so on. So I think that has to begin, because there's a social dimension to deterrence. Society has to be resilient. Bizarrely, on the recommendation of a colleague in what is now the Department of War as opposed to the Department of Defence, I'm just reading a book called Alas Babylon, which is set against the context of the 1959 missile gap and the Sputnik crisis. And there is a moment in that novel where the victims, essentially, of a nuclear attack on Florida are saying, on the US generally, Florida, of course, less badly hit because it hasn't got significant military targets at that date, no central command headquarters. They say, if only the public, if only the government had spoken to us, but they were so nervous about creating panic that they never had the conversation. And I think we need to treat the public more openly about that. The second point that I've made, and I've made it already in a different context, is that our thinking about deterrence is deterrence by denial because we're thinking in defensive terms. The trouble with that is that essentially the possession of nuclear weapons, I'm still talking about nuclear weapons in this context of deterrence, is about an offensive capability. And we simply can't have a conversation that is limited in that way if we're going to extract value from this investment that we're making. And the point about deterrence is a capacity to escalate the conflict. So we need to have that discussion too, and to recognise that deterrence by denial, when you have an adversary, in the case of Russia, who does use the threat of escalation, has to be countered by a threat of escalation. And the final point I would make in terms of this discussion is simply, where are we with our allies? Because again, there needs to be a more grown-up discussion. I mean, self-evidently, the understanding of a nuclear deterrent is it's a sovereign capability. But of course, in the UK's eyes, it's what we allocate it to NATO. In other words, it is there as part of our contribution to NATO, and a very significant part of our contribution to NATO. That has resulted in the last year in both Germany and Poland having to have conversations around this issue. It has in the past already, of course, produced a degree of Anglo-French congruence, which seems to me important. And we then have to think, if nuclear deterrence is to have a much higher salience within this discussion, what sort of capabilities do we need? Is it simply SSBNs, which is the route we're still committed to? We made a virtue of the F-35As and their acquisition, but they were in the acquisition program anyway. Do we really need a tactical or theatre capability? And the French are very nervous about that because they think it would lower the nuclear threshold within Europe, and that is understandable. That is precisely, we're back to old debates about deterrence. But I think, simply trotting out deterrence, we're improving defence in order to increase deterrence. But one of the challenges we have is if something is unused, and obviously we want nuclear weapons to be unused, so this is a challenge. If something is unused, it gradually loses deterrent effect. And I'm minded to think this is a conventional parallel. But before the 1982 Falklands War, the argument, of course, was Britain would do very little and NATO would also do very little. In the end, of course, Britain did respond and responded successfully to the Argentinian invasion. And then the response to that successful defeat of the campaign against the Argentinians was to say, this has enhanced deterrence. It has put NATO in a much stronger place because it shows that a NATO power is ready to use force.
I mean, I would say I'm from Barrow-on-Furness, so we understand the deterrent very, very well.
Okay, sorry.
But do you think the rest of society understands the importance?
No, because I mean, if I can go back to my, because we discussed this, if I may refer, I probably can't refer to another committee, but when I was on the committee, I was an advisor of the Committee on National Security Strategy, we used to come back to this argument quite a bit, and many members of the committee felt, well, you don't want to scare the horses, so we shouldn't put it too much up the agenda, and if we do, anti-nuclear lobbying will become greater. If you look at MOD's own figures in terms of understanding public opinion, I haven't seen the latest ones, there is a very wide understanding, even in areas of the United Kingdom where there would not be wide understanding. I include Scotland within this. It is not that different in terms of its responses. Most of the British public do understand why there is a nuclear deterrent. And that's without having a conversation with them. We should be less frightened of that conversation, because if we are frightened, we don't prepare the public for understanding. And of course people will be worried about an all-out nuclear exchange. They jolly well should be. I mean, not for a moment. That's precisely why it has effect. But we need to be much more open in our debate.
Thank you. What do you think of the impact of failing support for the international non-proliferation agreements will have on this, such as the expiration of the New START agreement? Well,
I think probably all of us around this table would want to have a constructive debate about nuclear arms limitation. And we ourselves in this country, of course, under the previous government, were going to increase the number of warheads that we had without fully explaining why we might want to do that and putting that within an arms control narrative. I think that if we don't take a lead on that, the argument for nuclear proliferation will get ahead of steam. We need to be seen to be active. But then that actually requires less a conversation between Moscow and Washington, because at least under the previous administration in the United States, even when there were escalatory threats, and I gather the UK and France were both included in this, there was a conversation, back-channel conversation between Moscow and London and Washington and Paris. But crucially, where is Beijing in that argument? And that seems to me the big question in terms of nuclear weapons and their control.
We've seen an escalation in attacks in the grey zone. Over recent years, we talk about the cyber attacks, and again, I would suggest that we don't talk about it enough publicly. People might see a delay to the shopping from Marks and Spencer's but not understand the implications of those attacks on our supply chain. I've also had recent discussions where offshore oil and gas are seeing more drones in their airspace. How do you think that the UK should develop its deterrence in the grey zone? And is the establishment of a new cyber command a good start? I could direct this at Dr. Deere.
I think that the establishment of the Cyber Command is a good thing. I mean, my view is we ought to have an independent cyber force and an independent space force, and until you truly have independence, you'll never get the arguments that you need to resource proportionate to the threat that you face, because those arguments have to run through single service career incentive systems that we're arguing against that we should invest more in cyber or more in space at the expense of the thing that your service does is not beneficial for promotion, and therefore there was a fantastic paper called Victory Through Space Power, which just crossed out the old victory through air power. It's the case made for the creation of independent air force. You just replace the word space, you read it and you think, well, if there's a case for an independent air force, then there's an equally strong case for an independent space force and an independent cyber force. And I think it's axiomatic. I think the logic is irrefutable, and I think it's only resisted because people are worried either about losing some of their slice of the pie in the wider intra-service competition that would generate, and also because of more broader change fatigue. So the Cyber and Special Operations Command is very much a good thing. Personally, I don't think it goes far enough, and I suspect some of the reviewers would agree with me.
On developing deterrence itself?
Well, I think on developing deterrence, it seems to me we have a really sort of kind of perverse compromise between political pragmatism, which allows us a kind of logical deterrence blindness. Like, logically, if Russia is running a war economy now, and if China is saying it wants to be ready to seize Taiwan if it needed to by 2027, then it doesn't make sense to say, well, we think we'll be ready by about 2030 when we're going to start investing enough. In fact, everything in deterrence theory would tell you that what you're now doing is making the risk of something happening greater because your adversary judges, well, we better act now before you've spent all that money and you've got there. So if you do believe the MOD and the UK's line on when we're going to spend this money, then it would require you to say, well, hang on a minute, we need to acknowledge that in what we're saying, we're accepting that we're increasing the short-term risk because we're providing an incentive for others to act now. And that's true in cyber and all domains. I think I come back to the maniacal need for more speed in everything that we do as well. The speed of technological change is such that we saw our first fully automated cyber attacks run on Anthropic's models reported just before Christmas. We're likely to see ever more agentic cyber attacks over the next year run by AI only at a scale that we are in no way ready for. And I think unless we move at the speed to deploy models that the US is, we're talking about 2 years to get to contract for major defence programs. The US AI strategy, defence AI strategy, published on the 9th of January, talks about 30 days to the deployment of the latest AI models. It talks about designing new capabilities within hours as requirements flow back from the front line. Well, that's hours in physical capabilities, but it's going to be minutes or seconds in cyber where you've just got to respond and build. So I think there's a real worry about the bending to the political pragmatism of, well, we couldn't possibly spend this much now, so therefore we'll be ready later, and that should suit us, and therefore we can balance our investment over time, and the need to respond to a threat that everybody can see is here now and accelerating rapidly technologically, and where we create an incentive for others to act sooner if they know that we're going to be ready later.
Again, I think, Marshal, I'll come back to is the public understanding of what's happening in the grey zone and the deterrence and what we need to spend on defence understood enough for us to justify that politically?
Very briefly, please, Marshal.
Yeah, well, I don't think so. And you talked about it's Michael Quinlan who spoke about the offensive spirit. Michael Quinlan, probably the last time we had in the Ministry of Defence a civil service official and intellectual that really thought through deterrence. So my point, Chair, is we actually need an intellectual rearmament at the moment to think through all of this. Then that needs to be transmitted to the general population. If I could link to a point you made earlier on in closing on this one, what Keith just pointed out, and to hammer it home, actually AI is very good at writing code, and things will happen really, really quickly. Our legal codes that sit there and say there will always be a man in the loop This is just one of those areas where we need to really think through and do it from a moral and ethical standpoint in a way that Michael Quinlan looked at deterrence, the nuclear weapon, and really think it through, because it's easier to be defensive, it's easier to be backward-leaning, it makes us feel good. But if you lose that offensive spirit that Michael Quinlan used to write about, then you have not got the ability to underpin deterrence and make people think twice. So these are very complicated questions, and I think we do need, as I say, that intellectual rearmament to gather them all together and think through the implications of them combined.
When we hit the point where AI can produce AI.
We're there now.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ian Rowe.
Yep. Air Marshal, I want to talk about the lessons learned from Ukraine. And the SDR goes in and says that we have demonstrated that the nation's armed forces are only as strong as the industry, innovators and investors that stand behind them. And that technological innovation is vital to stay ahead of its adversaries. So what are the priority lessons should we learn from Ukraine? And is it just limited to harnessing drones and data and digital warfare?
Well, no, as you've seen today, it's very much about the power industry. It's very much about the railways. So the first thing I'd say is the lessons of Ukraine, I would say, have to be evaluated by an independent commission. It can't be left to the MOD, and for the reasons, I won't rehearse what Keith said, but people in the MOD now are cherry-picking some of the selected answers because they support some of the cherished programmes. I would say you would need to put an independent committee to learn the lessons of Ukraine and feed in the way that our Committee for Imperial Defence between the wars would have looked at these sort of lessons and worked out what it means for mobilising society. And I would say that would have to feed in then to any sort of implementation of what's recommended in the SDR on some form of bill that needs to be tabled to support national mobilisation, national resilience, etc., etc. Because we've got out of the habit of that since 1989, when we drifted out of producing the war book nationally and just took it as a savings measure, and no one really noticed. So there's another area there of intellectual rearmament, and I think it starts with a broad-based non-military commission that looks at the lessons of Ukraine and then feeds them back in as we work out what it means to be a nation-state at war. And that is what underpins deterrence.
Can I ask you one specific question around drones and how that's affecting warfare today as it's never been conventionally used before?
Well, I just say my opening when I talked about the economics of lethality. This is the point, and I will link that to where I closed the last one, the intellectual rearmament. I mean, I am quite staggered that I still hear in many places, not least when we declared IOC for Ajax, reported widely, officers, when asked about this, well, what about drones? What about this? What about the battlefield we're seeing in Ukraine? Oh, but we wouldn't fight like the Ukrainians. That strikes me as a very complacent and rather arrogant statement to make. The future of warfare doesn't look exactly like Ukraine, but the future of warfare certainly involves a lot of what you're seeing in Ukraine adapted for the future theatres. And just look at what Israel did in managing to achieve air dominance over Iran for 12 days. And it did it with some of the conventional capabilities that we have in the UK, and it did it with some of those clever drone-based, cyber-based and intelligence-led capabilities that you're seeing in Ukraine. And at the moment, I don't see that blend of thinking applied to the way that we do the force development for our own forces.
Can I come in and build on Marshal Edwards' point? I think one of the really interesting narrative arcs we've seen through Ukraine was a starting point where we said people were arguing quite loudly that drones didn't really matter, they were just a side issue, they weren't really making any difference, to suddenly actually drones are really important, but they're only really important as an augmented capability to large crewed systems. They're only really going to, now we need autonomous collaborative platforms that sit aside and support. And it seems to me that sort of fundamentally misunderstands the nature and rate of progress again. We've gone from systems that were doubling in agentic capabilities every 7 months to agentic capabilities doubling every 4 months. What that means in real terms is in 2023, AI models could complete tasks that took humans about 30 seconds. In 2025, they could complete tasks, I should say, to 50% of what a human would do, but the point is the trajectory. They could complete tasks that would take humans an hour last year. On the current trajectory, by 2029, they'll be able to complete tasks that take humans a full working year. Now that sounds remarkable, but that progress continues to rise. All of the underlying trends are moving in the same direction. People often say, oh yeah, but you're mostly talking about coding, Keith, but I'm not. I'm talking about scientific reasoning, maths, robotics, self-driving systems, and the use of computers for tasks. So in a world where AI is able to complete tasks that would take a human a full working year, we're seeing such a rapid increase in autonomy that any bet that says we need a fully crewed or partially crewed system by, 2030, is a fairly large bet against AI progress. And so far, everybody who's bet against AI progress, whether it was AI won't be able to beat us at chess, 1997 AI won't be able to beat us at Go because of human intuition, AI won't ever beat us at poker because humans are better at bluffing, AI won't be able to out-reason us until it did, winning international maths Olympiads. Now we're saying AI will never be able to outperform us in judgment, and AI will never be able to outperform us in controlling vehicles of all types. And it just seems to me that that's the next thing that's going to fall. And on those rates, 2x every 4 months, it's going to fall very, very quickly. So I think the key question for the committee to consider is, like, what time horizon are you considering the future of war against? And then what does that mean against the rate of progress in the technologies that I've described? Because we're on for something like a Cambrian explosion in scientific advancement and in AI capabilities if the trends continue as they are. So you need to come to a view, I think, on, well, do you expect those current trajectories to stop or do you expect them to continue? What does UK government and UK defence think? Because any bet in the other direction to say, no, they only mean self-driving systems, in this case drones, are only going to have this much impact on the future of war, is a pretty big bet against the progress that we're seeing to date. And it would be my guess that on the balance of probabilities that will continue.
Defence reform comes into all that as well, I think. Is the MOD ready? So could I ask you, I want to just move on to my next one because I know time's limited. To what extent might an emphasis on the Ukraine conflict distort our understanding of overshadowing lessons drawn from other theatres of war?
Well, I think obviously there are peculiarities. I mean, in the Ukraine conflict, but I think much more important is the point that Ed made, which is the tendency, particularly in the United States, I have to say this isn't how we would fight. You know, what's become an attritional, protracted conflict is, of course, what we would try to avoid. And of course, we would try to avoid it, but could we avoid it is a rather different question. And when he talks about lessons learned from this and the way to address them, I think there's some big handfuls of things because we concentrate on the things like the drone debate, which we fail to pay attention to. First of all, Ukraine still hasn't got an effective system of conscription, and it never thought about it properly before the outbreak or before the major invasion. It thought about lots of things between 2014 and 2022, but it did not address, it still hasn't got a whole of manpower approach to the mobilization of society, and it is suffering dramatically from that, both in terms of numbers at the front line, but also in terms of the societal implications of using manpower, and by man I mean men and women with this, obviously, in ways that actually reflect the skills that individuals have. You don't want an IT expert being a frontline infantryman. You know how you get these things in. They also are still very much a land-dominated headquarters with a land-dominated approach. Ed is, of course, and Keith are very much involved in the air dimension, but I would just point up, what is happening in terms of the economic war. If you attend any briefing, people talk about what will happen in 2027. I mean, it used to be 2026, before that it used to be 2025, in terms of Russia's economic crisis and the way that might have an effect on the war, and equally, of course, to the point at which Ukraine can no longer sustain the fight either, which, of course, we sort of sustain by dribbling, but we don't sustain by giving overwhelming superiority. These seem to be the big handful of questions which we need to address. On the other hand, what Ukraine has got absolutely right, and it's a very unfashionable word to use now because we use other euphemisms, is the propaganda war. They've fought a brilliant propaganda war in terms of getting international support and in terms of generating support domestically. A society that many expected to collapse internally because there would be the effects of corruption or pro-Russian sentiment, that would cause division, and so far it hasn't. There are tensions there, but they've dealt with it.
Brilliant. Thank you. Right, we've only got about 40 odd minutes, and there are huge areas yet to cover. So we want to delve deeply into the SDR, the DIS, as well as obviously strengthening the defence industrial base. But before we go into those three areas, just a couple of quick supplementaries, please. Mike Martin.
Thanks, Chair. Just to pick up on this point from you, Keith, about how the trends in AI and agentic AI are all upwards. I think, as has been mentioned, we went to go and see submarines being built in Barrow last week. They're obviously massive, exquisite bits of kit that are crude and take decades to procure. Does that not seem a little mad, holding those two things up against each other? Or what would you do if you were faced with that problem?
Well, I think Atlantic Bastion is moving in the right direction. So large numbers of autonomous, likely attritable systems that can be produced in much shorter timelines, working in an integrated system. I think that seems a pretty sensible bet. I'm not necessarily suggesting you need to go all in on this, but that 10% of the defence budget into novel technologies would see you transition over time and position you to transition when you needed to fully. So if they do prove obsolete, which I'm not arguing they will, but if they were to prove obsolete, you'd be ready for that, having prepared and hedged against that outcome. And I think Atlantic Bastion is moving in the right direction, but we don't have an equivalent of Atlantic Bastion in either of the other services. Just for wider awareness, Atlantic Bastion is an attempt by the Royal Navy principally to have an outcomes-based procurement. We wish to achieve this. Can industry build it? To then hand over essentially to fund industry to build that solution, and to do it not based on just large capital expenditures of the kind of things that Mike is asking about, but to do it through at the speed of change that we're currently seeing, so you don't end up with those huge cost overruns. So I think there's some good signs there, but you need that on a much bigger scale.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks, Chair. Morning, everyone. Dr. Keith Deere, just going back on what you said before, do you think there's anyone you can point to in the MOD or indeed in government who understands the pace of the advancements in AI that you've just described?
Yeah, I think we should be fair and say there are quite a few people. I don't know if I'm doing many favours by naming them. Well, I mean, an obvious one would be Jade Lung as the Prime Minister's AI advisor. Previously, Matt Clifford, very seized of how important all of this is, making all of those arguments internally. There are other people within DCIT more broadly. There are a handful of people across the MOD. So there are those people. Are they winning the argument? Well, to some extent, but they're doing it around the system by trying to work through a system that isn't really set up to move at anything like the speed, anything like the urgency, and with a broader kind of dogmatic commitment to perpetual scepticism against AI, which I think is just a fundamental problem across government. So that those people do exist, and as I say, I'm not going to name all of them because I really think you don't necessarily help, but they do exist, and more power to their elbow. The problem is they're working within a system that just isn't set up to move at the speed that technology is moving, and against the kind of thresholds we're reaching, well, now, really. As Edward says, it's not anymore, well, this might come in a few years, it's here now. Fully agentic cyber attacks run through Anthropic's cyber models. Logan Graham was my former colleague in Number 10 and the Prime Minister's AI advisor now at Anthropic. He said this year, Anthropic expects self-improving cyber-physical systems. So that's robots that self-improve themselves as they learn over time. Well, those things might be building the submarines that Mike refers to. So I think there are those people. I don't think they have the influence that they need to, and I just don't think the system is set up to cope with the speed of change that we're seeing.
Yeah.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Thank you very much. On to Jesse Norman.
Yeah, and of course, arguably, the idea of a platform isn't compatible with the speed that you're describing.
Right.
Can I just? I've got a couple of questions, but I don't want which go to defence capability and sovereign power. But Sir Hugh, before we start on that, can I ask you something to pick up on what you said earlier about law? And I should declare interests of my own in training and skills in this area. But you talked about the rules-based international order. Now, of course, there are two issues there very quickly just to touch on. One is the process of going to war, which arguably has in parliamentary terms been very badly compromised by the Iraq war experience, which dipped the hands of parliamentarians in a piece of what had previously been, as it were, prerogative foreign policy, and therefore diminished accountability. I'd be grateful if you could comment on that. And then the second is the question of the use of law and indeed the replacement of the law of armed combat by rights-based law, which is asymmetric in its effects and doesn't necessarily, in this modern world, buy us as much legitimacy. Of course, we think it's the right thing to do, but it has a social impact as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the problem here is there's an essential paradox of the whole construction of international law and war, which is a prohibition on interstate war except in cases of self-defense on the one hand, and a desire to enable armed forces to go to war, but within a legal framework. And there are, that is at one level an absurd paradox incapable of solution, except in cases of national self-defense. So you need to argue when you go to war, whether you're accounting to Parliament or whether you're accounting to the wider international audience through the UN, that you are going to war for the sake of self-defense. And the result is, of course, and Iraq is a case in point, the argument for self-defense got stretched beyond the bounds of credibility in order to sustain that argument. And the UN Security Council resolution became, at least for the then government in this country, the be-all and end-all of justifying what we were doing, and it didn't come through. Should there be direct parliamentary control of that? My view is no, because actually short-term crisis might require the Prime Minister to make an immediate response. And should he be accountable to Parliament for that decision? Of course he should be accountable to Parliament, but that is the President we have already, that, the Prime Minister.
And arguably that accountability is reduced by having parliamentary votes on these matters.
Yes, and I would agree. I mean, I think David Cameron had a real problem with I'm losing track of years, 2012, with the whole issue of how to proceed in relation to Syria, right. Which was a problem very largely of his own making, in my view. So that's one side of the argument. As far as rights-based law is concerned in relation to the law of armed conflict, I think we've got two pressures which are actually in some ways disabling the armed forces and the use of armed force. One is a very well-developed system of international law, beginning with the 1977 additional protocols, covering particularly non-state actors in relation to war, which of course were largely legacy instruments to deal with post-1945 colonial conflicts, which are now applied in other contexts. And on top of that, the International Criminal Court, of which we are members and supporters, but the United States is not, which, of course, we wish to endorse and support because that would absolutely cement our position in terms of being a supporter of international law, but which is jeopardized principally by, much more than by our own use of rights-based law, but the United States application of rights-based law, which is essentially domestic law being applied in an international context. So there are real challenges here, and I think we have to go to a situation. I mean, one issue, the much bigger issue is UN reform and how much anybody is up for UN reform in order to make it a more effective instrument. How do you give the UN General Assembly, which broadly speaking actually has voted in directions which you would want to support, when it isn't in great power interests, in particular members of the Security Council interests? And the other issue, as I've said, is how you align the legitimate use of armed force with the capacity to use that armed force in ways which were effective. And the Ottawa Convention on Landmines is a classic illustration of that dilemma, because if you're fighting a defensive war in a land context, you need to use landmines in the current setup, as Russia's immediate neighbours are recognising. And you can't just take a position solely on the basis of what you see as an international agreement to which you have become party, if that actually jeopardises your own national sovereignty.
And might in fact increase the likelihood of war.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's incredibly helpful. Thank you. So I'm going to reverse the order of questions that the clerks have put, not that I ever ask those questions anyway, and just start with the sovereign defence question and sovereign capability question. And maybe I could start with you, Dr. Deere. You've talked about AGI and intelligence. Of course, there's a whole series of equivocations about the word intelligence there. Let's leave that. My own view is capability is a more useful word than intelligence. But can you just set out where you think our sovereign capabilities ought to be, and how good we are at thinking about those strategically in the way you would like?
I think there's no upper limit on the amount of intelligence, however you define it, that we might wish to access if we accept that all of the things we care about are the products of intelligence, as I said earlier, weapons, tactics, strategies, policies, so forth. So if that's true, then there's probably no upper limit on the amount of energy that we will need. So the more intelligent the models become, the more energy they're going to need. And we're seeing 10x improvements in the efficiency of models every 12 months, and yet we're seeing demand rise as the models become more capable. So I think that just continues, particularly if we're in a wartime situation. And therefore, I think energy independence, or at least the ability to scale your energy supply rapidly, is going to be absolutely crucial, and is probably the most important determinant thing of where you get to, assuming that allies were willing to share their models with you. Absent that, I think it would be wonderful to think that the UK could be doing two things at the same time. It could be building models in the way that the big US AI companies are, investing them at the same scale, and at the same time rushing them into industry in the way that China is. But we don't have the industry, and we don't have the ambition, I think, frankly, in building the models in the UK. I think, therefore, a more kind of spread betting approach to
It also doesn't seem as though we have the intelligence strategically to understand that there are different ways in thinking about model construction, and that, for example, China is adopting different approaches to America, and there may be therefore a spectrum which we could play effectively with sovereign ability.
I think that's right, but I think we need to sort of disaggregate the we. So, for example, ARIA's Nature Computes Better programme might be one of those big bets on the future that sees biological architectures as the path to much more efficient and effective intelligence, perhaps the path to superintelligence, perhaps a path that completely surpasses the in-silicon versions of AI. So there certainly are bits of, there's a government-adjacent agency, but there are bits of government that think about this in the right way, that do see it. But then the question is, do we allocate capital, time, attention, resources proportionate to the opportunity that those kind of alternative architectures offer? And I think the answer to that is no. I think similarly the same with compute infrastructure. I think the arguments that Matt Clifford and others have made in government for what we need to do are right, but the speed at which we're pursuing them is nowhere near proportionate to the risk, threat and opportunity that we face. So I think the idea that you can completely own the stack isn't even true of the US, right? Like the chips that they rely upon are in turn reliant on machine tools built by ASML out for the Netherlands. So like complete sovereignty, I think everybody accepts is not possible. The problem is that can become too much of a hand-wringing argument for no sovereignty. And I don't think that's good enough, and I also think it dilutes the focus on, well, what can we do? What agency do we have, and how quickly do we need to move?
So compute and energy and nuclear. Ed, did you want to add additional sovereign capability? I've said nuclear, but maybe there's a question mark on that.
I just sort of emphasise, and the spread betting across alternative architectures is something the UK could and is doing, but could do much more broadly than it is if it wishes to bet on the future.
Have you written about that?
Yes.
Well, I'd be very interested to see that if you wanted to send it in. Thanks.
We need to work out what prototype warfare looks like. We're still orientated around designing things that you have to cut big amounts of steel, and you have to design the spec and agree the spec, and then the lawyers will spend 20 years arguing about whether, as British Aerospace, or the combo around it, building the carrier you agreed, and who's going to change. And we need to move to something that the software world has been working with a long time, which is a min-viable product. Create a min-viable product, get it out to the front line, back to my point, get the services to take min-viable products and get clever young troops working out, and then send the results back to industry. So we need to think through the model of how you do prototype warfare. And then your defence industrial strategy is not picking winners, it's creating the financial conditions and the conditions for industry, energy supply, energy costs, compute power. Those are the things that are going to allow these companies to be successful. So government needs to set the conditions and get out of the way. And I think at the moment what it's trying to do is shift a model where we define big military plant, and the way we build it. And it's trying to reluctantly move that to thinking of information age products in the same way.
It sounds like the defence and security strategies we have at the moment are not only failing to acknowledge the point about the substantive requirements, but they're also just the wrong shape and design to hit the concerns that are being articulated by this panel.
Yes, you're trying to find exactly what you need and then find a way of building it over the next 10 years, and that's not going to work. And in fact, the SDR, I only reread it again this morning to make sure I wasn't misremembering, does say you cannot now start defining over a 10-year time frame exactly what you're going to get in 10 years' time, but you need to be building a system that can build it possibly only minutes before you actually need it, given the speed that design is going.
Thanks. So Hugh, did you want to come in on anything?
Well, I'll just make one historical point and one alliance point. I mean, the historical point would be that in wartime, for sure, the whole procurement process is, even in the two world wars, is months, and you've got this continuous feedback loop from front to rear and design and adaptation, and we simply lost any sight of that. The other point would be spread betting in relation to allies, because we're not going to have a fully sovereign capability. So whom do we rely on in the current environment? And that is a very difficult question. So you're going to have spread bets there too. And my reading, in some ways, of the two US documents is that if we become partners rather than dependents, we're more likely to get what we want than if we don't. But we still won't get it if the US is engaged in a major war with China, because it won't have the capacity to give us what we want, because they'll want it. And that really is the core question, because not even the US, I mean, the weakness of the US national security strategy and national defense strategy is it doesn't address its own lack of capabilities for the threats that it thinks it's confronting. It assumes they're there. And it stresses economic growth, it stresses the defence industrial base. It doesn't actually say how it's going to get there to deal with this problem either. But without that, how will it be able to supply as it wants to supply and has supplied to the United Kingdom if it's also engaged in dealing with its own hemispheric threats?
Tiny follow-up question. When a drones company tries to indigenize a drones business in this country, but is a sovereign capability of another country, should we regard that as adding to our sovereign capability, or should we regard it as a potential strategic weakness?
It could be either.
I think who owns it? Who owns the output? How does it feed in? I think part of the problem is if you generate the IP, it will go overseas. So where's it going to go to?
Just ask the question. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ian Rowe, please.
Right, thank you. First to Keith. How is the absence of the defence investment plan impacting preparations for current and future conflict?
Well, central focus of the Strategic Defence Review was around the digital targeting web. And the MOD's got a genuinely very capable team put together to lead the work on that. The digital targeting web, as conceived in the SDR, was fundamentally a new operating concept to Ed's point, a theory of winning, an argument for how we would fight and win future conflict, with everything flowing back from that. So it could not be more central. And the SDR set a deadline of an MVP, I think by this year, but certainly by 2027, so a minimum viable product being in existence. Well, the absence of that funding and the further delays to the DIP has resulted in the pausing of the forthcoming industry day, and therefore the progress on that, I think it's hard to argue that it isn't stalling. And that's I mean that's just one kind of example, but of like these, one of the central, most totemic things in the SDR being slowed down by delays. I would suggest by delays in decision making. I can't prove the causal link, but it seems to me pretty obvious that's what the link is. So it's having a real and meaningful effect. I think we're also seeing, for all the talk of the need to deploy more capital, we are not seeing any of that reflected in the rapid award of contracts in new areas, which you would expect. I mean, the MOD could have a dashboard to show how much, like what is invested in is the 10% of novel technologies, and how much money has been allocated, and to who you could watch it in real time, but none of that exists. And I mean, some of that exists because the MOD just doesn't think about dashboards in that sense of tracking progress and outcomes publicly. But some of it also is the delays that mean that progress isn't happening.
Ed, have you got anything to add to that? Obviously, the DIP was supposed to have come out in autumn. Then we were told towards the end of the year. Now we're told it's going to be March. What do you think's holding it up?
Well, I think it's this point that it's trying to make this 10-year silk chart work. It's trying to predict the future and then allocate monies over that. Does everyone understand what I mean by the silk chart the MOD has as all these all these big programs? And so it to me, and I agree with Keith, I don't know exactly what the causal factor is, but it looks like, because we don't know where Ajax is going, because some of the other big programs in E7 Wedgetail in the Air Force, where you can't agree everything, so you can't agree anything. And the point I would make here to link this to the problems of the industry is not just, as Keith said, things are moving very, very quickly, but these companies have to keep churning or they die. And the big cultural void between the tech sector and a lot of the public sector, and I speak for those in uniform and without, is they don't get the need for speed. They don't get that, if his company has a design team, he can't sit there for 3 months and then 6 waiting for someone to sign it off. He's got to move on. And so one of the key things that the NAD has got to do is appreciate the relationship that defence has with the big primes, and some of that won't change, but it's also got to reconstruct. And what the problem with the defence investment plan tells me is it's business as usual as it's been for the last couple of decades, and we haven't understood, even though the rhetoric is we've got to work with small and medium enterprises, we've got to get into bed with tech. We don't understand what keeps them alive, and we might be killing them.
And does future warfare require a different approach to design and production of platforms, given potential attrition rates in a peer conflict?
Well, I mean, I'd just say briefly, yes. I mean, yes, it does. We're seeing the shift, as I think I said, from very complicated manned hunter killer platforms, of which something like you saw at Barrow, the SSN is the ultimate exemplar, to something where you have a much more federated network where every individual platform, however big, warhead, is connected, and the thinking glue is somewhere in that cloud, making the decisions that that Keith has referenced. So that future of warfare does look very different, and your defence industrial base and the supply chains behind it are going to look very different too.
Depends what you mean by future warfare. I mean, we've assumed major interstate war, aren't we? I mean, that's the burden of the question, but of course, you don't know.
Yeah. I mean, where's technology going to take us? Keith, do you want to?
Well, I think also in peacetime and grey zone conflicts, being able to innovate and develop new capabilities at the speed of technological advance is essential to being able to deter effectively, and showing your industrial base can move that quickly is equally central. I risk drawing Sir Hugh's eye here by referencing history, which I've tried to avoid since his earlier comment. But I think if you look at the way in which we developed capabilities in the past, go back far enough, we would invent the weapon, and then we'd spend an awful lot of time figuring out how it could be optimally deployed in combat. By the time we got to the First World War, that was beginning to change, because scientific advances were such we could start with, well, what's the operational problem, and invent the technology to solve it. I think by the time we got to the 1970s with DARPA's assault breaker, we were thinking concept first. So we were looking at the Soviets and saying, well, hang on a minute, we've got second echelon forces, how are we going to beat them? And we came up with a plan that was concept first, or okay, well, we're going to win here by having precision guided missiles, sensors that can see through clouds, aircraft that can fly at low level, Apaches, drones, a whole raft of things that now dominate modern warfare. But it was the idea and the thinking and the concept that came first. How are we going to win? And the technology followed. And I think in an era where, again, back to that US AI strategy, I can't say it enough times, they are talking about speed being at the absolute centre of everything, and new weapons being created in hours in response to intelligence. In that world, if you try to follow technological trends, you are only going to fall further and further behind the frontier. You have to think concept first. Where are we going, and how do we build for the world? How do we win for the fight that's coming, rather than just following the technological trends? Because it's a certain path to falling further and further behind where others are who do adopt that approach.
And following on from that, for the length of time that it takes to procure this new technology, is there a danger that it's out of date by the time it gets produced?
It's a danger, and it's a reality on almost every major defence programme that we have.
Which is why we mentioned prototype warfare. You don't want to be buying things and put them on the shelves and they're obsolete in months.
Quick supplementary from Mike Marshal.
Is it not even an extension of that, where you have AI that's reading your opponent's systems, designing the counter, and then they're being 3D printed and shipped out and then run by a cloud AI where there's no humans in there? So effectively, your entire defence industrial base is taken over by agentic AI, which then 3D prints. All you need to do is provide energy and raw materials.
Mike, may I, forgive me jumping in quickly, but I mean, yes, I'm sort of, you definitely preaching to the converted. But B, I think there's so many in defence who would say, no, that will never be true. It would be treated as an absurdity. But I think that's fine.
If you drones in Ukraine now.
Yeah, no, I agree. But I think they would say, well, it might be true of these niche capabilities here, but it's not true of much wider defence industrial capacity. But I think the question at that point to ask is, okay, but like we want to get beyond this dogmatic commitment to perpetual scepticism. So what is it would change your mind? You know, when that happened to DeepMind, when people started to say, well, all you ever do is win at these games, like, okay, you want at chess, you want at Go, you want at shogi. What Deep...
I can't answer that, because organisations only evolve when they're under threat of extinction, right? So, and that's the MOD, and
yes.
The UK will only get its arse in, when we are at threat of national survival.
So I think that's true. I think when the feedback loops are there, when you start failing, you start improving, because you can't. Nobody can deny anymore what's happening. But I think you specifically, as a committee, have a real power here to say what would change your mind. Like, what is it that would convince you that AI will do the things you've described? Because then we can set out the challenges to prove otherwise. We can set up the benchmarks to say, well, if a model could do this, then we would believe that this is possible.
Yeah.
And I think you have a real power to change that.
All of you have effectively said that we have an analogue MOD in a digital age, and it's totally failing to meet the moment.
Marshal, you want to come back on that just very briefly, please, yeah?
Well, to answer, how would you test that? And both Keith and I, many years ago, were involved in a technology demonstrator program to build the virtual world. And we used exactly your arguments. We said, if you can build a virtual twin, test it in... Yeah, that was one. There are other companies that are available. In your virtual world now, all the real world intelligence gets put in, you model all sorts of contingencies, and yes, the science fiction element was eventually you just hit print and the 3D print will print the weapons off when you actually need them. We don't think we're quite there yet, but we are getting closer and closer and closer to that. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. On to Michelle Scroggum.
Thank you. Last year's SDR talked about a whole of society approach to bolster the UK's resilience. How do you think that moving that way will have an impact on the challenges that we face for future warfare?
Do you want me to start? I mean, I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about this. We need to move beyond talking to doing. There's been a lot of talk about, how do we get whole of society response? How do we think about national resilience? We failed to build on the experience of COVID-19 when there was a whole of society response to a threat.
There was a whole of society response?
There was a local community effort which certainly, in my experience, was generated from bottom up, not top down. And we've simply failed to bottle that in terms of where we could put that elsewhere in comparable contexts. Much of the issue about cybersecurity is about people obeying basic disciplines themselves in the workplace, which they don't do. Far too complicated to change your passwords regularly and engage with that sort of approach to it. So there is an element of bottom-up approach, which, again, it's about having a dialogue. It goes back to my answer on deterrence with people in order to help them understand how they can contribute to make that happen, instead of mocking what is going on. But I think in relation specifically to the SDR, we are nowhere near having any concept of how we would generate mass, how we would replace the existing armed forces in the event. We talked a lot, of course, about what technologies will do. But if we look at casualty rates in the war in Ukraine, we have no idea how we would confront that. We don't want to have a debate on conscription. It's too difficult. So we go round the houses looking at other alternatives, which imply some element of voluntary engagement.
We did look when we visited Finland. Their whole of society approach is totally different.
Finland's a totally different response, but of course they have a cultural awareness, they have a historical precedent, they have a discussion going on the whole time. And we are self-evidently not in that position. But let's take the Scandinavian countries, which are now thinking collaboratively across Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway about how they do this, and how different their experiences are. Because, for example, Norway, its threat as it sees it's to the north, but its population base is in the south. How does it actually get a conscripted army to be in the right place at the right time? How do you think about where the contribution is, let's say, of the IT specialist who also happens to be a service reservist, when mobilised, which is the priority, to remain in the IT job or to go and fulfil the service reservist job? You need to think that one through in advance. What allowances are you making financially, either to the employer or to the family of the person concerned, particularly if there's a drop in salary as a result of fulfilling the reservist obligation? We look at the future in terms of, for example, of one of the commitments in the SDR is to think about increasing the cadet force. If you don't have any adult volunteers, and at the moment there's a massive shortage of adult volunteers in the cadet force, you won't have an increase in the cadet force. So are you going to pay your adults to be volunteers, or are you going to think of another solution to the problem?
If we're going to go down that line, I should put on record that my son is a volunteer in the cadet force. We're not advocating for them to be paid.
There are some wonderful adult volunteer cadets. I was Lord Lieutenant of my county for 10 years, and I got to see a lot of them in action. So, yes, of course, but the point is there are not enough. So my issue is not that we don't recognise the need for national resilience or don't have the discussion, we do, but what we haven't done is move to the point, either specifically within the MOD, about how we think about that and how we replace the armed forces that are currently in existence on the assumption that they won't survive a protracted conflict, not, I'm afraid, in their entirety. We're talking about lethality, we're talking about attrition in current warfare. This carries implications. We need to think how we replace those people. But also, in a wider societal terms, we're not talking about the practical steps that we would need to take in order to enable this to happen. We tell people they need to have bottled water and they need to have generators at home, and all those things are good advice, but it goes beyond that.
Thank you very much. On to Emily Orr.
Thanks, Chair. What should be in the Defence Readiness Bill?
Ooh,
great
question. Well, lead off with that. What are the lessons from Ukraine, and then the applied element of that? Do as you have done, go to Finland and other places and demonstrate how that resilient society actually converts into a confident society, converts into actually a vibrant economy, and do what is in the government's defence industrial strategy, which is let's talk about making this as an element of growth. And some of the risks that any government can take if it's applied to companies like Keith's, there'll be dual use, just as Sweden and Finland have very good fifth generation IT companies. And then after that, things such as you need to think about the mobilisation of the reserve and how you'd answer the questions that Hugh's put forward. You need to consider the fact that a lot of our critical national infrastructure is now in private hands, especially in the digital sphere, data centres, etc., etc. What are the critical industries and how would you take them over? As Keith's pointed out, the American administration has said, if your AI becomes so critical, we can nationalise it. We've got out of the business of civil defence, and we need to think through how, and that's part of the denial part of deterrence. So I would just throw those in as openers.
Dr. Dean.
I'd offer a couple of things. I think first and foremost we need a war book, and a war book on the scale that we had one before. I think it's what we do, what we say, not what we say, that matters most around that, to enable that national conversation. And seeing that the government was making every department, the BBC and others, have a plan for how we would respond in the event of war would show that we were serious and enable a much more grown-up conversation around what that means, as opposed to... I think the Defence Readiness Bill would be really clear in demanding a war book and really clear in the level of detail that was required in it to be something approaching what we've had previously. I think it would commit us to two things that Senator Warner did in about 2010 in the US. So back then there was the House, I think it was the House Armed Services Committee, managed to push into legislation that the US had to have 50% of all frontline capabilities fully autonomous by, if I recall correctly, 2015. Most of the capabilities we have today were driven by that mandate. They had no choice. They were forced to do it. I was on exchange with the USAF at the time. They hated it. They had to do it. Eventually they got it unwound, which is why we haven't gone as far as we might. So that Defence Readiness Bill for me would define what AI first means, it would define what novel technologies are, and it would make a demand for much greater autonomy to a level of percentage of frontline capabilities. So I think all of those things would be essential if we're going to have any chance of moving at the speed that we need to.
I would say just-in-time logistics have to be addressed because I was staggered to read that we still produce 60% of our own food the other day. That's the same as it was in 1914. And we thought we weren't ready. And there was 6 weeks supply in the country, so we need to think about that. We need, in the same vein, to think about the relationship between this and issues like war insurance. Do we have a war insurance potentially scheme in place? And we need to have discussions which stopped, I think, in about the 1960s between the Navy and the merchant tonnage on which we rely. Extraordinarily complicated now with flags of convenience, shipping regulations and all the rest of it, but we are essentially, we focus again and again on fighting power and the land dimension of that, which I say in the presence of 2 airmen, but there is a great deal of attention on that because that is our image from the past. But our image from the past we actually need to think about is how do we do this economically over the long term? And we haven't begun to engage with that discussion, it seems to me.
So I think, judging by that, it's going to be quite a large bill and have quite a price ticket attached to it, but also it's around how can you build into legislation provisions that keep pace with rapid changes in the ways of war, with artificial intelligence, how, you referred to the war book, but we're in a different time now. How would you legislate for things that are events are going to be taken over that legislation? What do we do there?
Can I just say very quickly, a plan is better than no plan. It may not be the right one at the time. You're almost certainly going to have to adapt it because the circumstances won't be fully as you've anticipated. There won't be perfection in this. It's a bit like the procurement argument. If you don't think about this at pace and if you don't have a risk appetite, you won't get there. It won't be perfect. But if you don't even think about it, you've got nothing.
I think 2 other things. I think one is organisational design. We don't have a system that's designed to sense respond and respond rapidly to threats. Everything is designed to slow things down in Whitehall rather than to kind of get things done. So I think it would start with machinery of government redesign, specifically around our national security as opposed to primarily our defence architectures. Defence would come second, so I think that would be essential. And then secondarily, and I would say this, wouldn't I, given what my business does, but we have a science of forecasting and prediction now, and you would apply that at scale everywhere because everything is prediction. Like a decision is a prediction. If I do this, I expect this to be the outcome. Tactics, strategies, they're a form of prediction. If we do this, we expect this to happen. Resilience is a prediction. Well, we need to invest here in order to avoid this outcome. And today we have models. We deploy the world's leading model genuinely in this domain, ahead of Grok, OpenAI, DeepMind, that are performing at super forecaster levels in predicting the future. So you would apply AI, you would apply collective intelligence tools to leverage the best of humans, and you would do that continuously and in real time to anticipate what you needed to respond to, and then in turn to predict what you should do to respond to maximally mitigate any threat. And that thinking just I don't think exists in government at the moment. I think we're still thinking about planning as a thing that's done by a group of humans sat around a table having an argument over what needs to be done, not the application of the science of forecasting under uncertainty and the increasing use of AI to do that much more efficiently and effectively. Yeah.
Do you think a bill is such a bill is needed or not? Or do you think government should just get on with doing what they need to do?
No, I think without a bill, much of this won't happen.
Right. Just checking.
I agree with that completely, yeah.
One thing I would say positively, and I don't know how far it's even been responsive, people have talked from time to time about the need for an incoming government to go through a war game exercise, actually to experience what it would be like and to come up to speed with that. Memorably, New Zealand did try it once, and the pilots, it happened on a Saturday afternoon, perhaps the All Blacks were playing a match. But anyway, the pilots had drunk rather a lot who were designed to get people and they couldn't respond because they did it the day they chose it. Of course, it was the day when people weren't expecting it. So just to get people sensitized to the issues is all we're talking about, would be a starting point.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Right, I know we're coming to the end of our session, but I want to bring in Mike Martin and then Derek Twigg. Mike Martin.
Are we going to reform our systems and processes sufficiently to be ready for war without ending up in a war?
No.
Ed?
Everywhere I go at the moment, not just in defence, but the think tank world that was referenced at the start, within 5 minutes the discussion comes back to the thicket of process, and not just of Whitehall, but of all the regulators around it, the judicial reviews. I think a fundamental problem at the moment is the ability to get anything done, and unless that is addressed, short of a shock that really gets us nearly, a Cuban Missile Crisis that really shocks us, then I think at the moment we're still churning the old processes and hoping for different outcomes.
Or a Suez where we rhetorically, get ourselves into a fight where we can't cash the cheque. Keith?
I think proportionally it's still much less likely that we get into a major conventional war probabilistically than that we do. And I think it's important that we don't overhype the threat, that we look at how likely is it. I think what's changing is the likelihood of that happening is increasing without it still being like greater than 50%. And what we're not doing is seeing... Sorry?
What percentage would you put it at?
Yes,
with the best model in the world for super forecasting?
Well, if you would like, you're very welcome to commission Cassi to do it, but I would offer you my personal. I would say we're around 20% now, where a few years ago we would have been around 10. And I think and depending on how far back you want to go, so 2014 that's the kind of where we were. Now I would say we're up at around 20%, and I think that's a much bigger risk, and we ought to be investing proportionate to it, and I don't think we are, and that's my concern. It's not to say we're more likely than not to get into a major conventional war, because I don't think that's the case, but unless you prepare, then you'll see that probability increase over time. That's kind of I think the point that we're all making.
Okay, so just to finish on this, we had that conversation earlier about sovereign capability. So AI, energy, nuclear, and I'd probably add intelligence collect onto that. But you got those for you need to do those as a UK. What other areas of tech do you think that we should be looking into? And then once you've named those areas of tech, could you comment on where our research base is on those areas and where our industrial base is on those areas? Perhaps, Ed, if I could start with you.
I think you've covered it. It's worth highlighting the intelligence one, and that's where Europe really has to get its act together. And I think the problem here is if you... Right back to the first answer. If you have removed America from that Western bloc, what you've actually removed is the team coach, the team captain, and a lot of the backroom staff. And it is very difficult to see who in Europe now would step up. Because if the Brits step up, you're not in the EU anymore. The Brexit, if the French step up, the Germans will be concerned. The French won't want the Germans to run. Everyone's happy to play second fiddle and let America dictate. So how do we actually organise 600 million West Europeans to actually deliver the clout that their economic latency suggests we should be able to do? And I would start with that intelligence. How do you replace the Five Eyes intelligence that's actually driven by American Collect? And then you might start to flesh some of the other elements out. Within the national sovereign base, I think you've covered them all, and there's nothing that immediately leaps out.
And no other areas of tech that you think we should be looking into?
I would like to see us invest a bit more in the space environment as well. We've talked quite a good game there. We're good at the apps around it, but core space capacity is another area where we could invest more.
I'd start by echoing space. I think space will be the most lucrative market in human history. I think it's probably going to be the primary determinant of your relative power in the international system. And I think we have no conception of its central import to our relative power in the future. So I'd like to see much more investment and a really serious space program in the UK. And I know how that makes me sound, and I still think we should do it, and happy to put it on record. I think we have real leadership in quantum computing because successive governments were investing quite early on. We had a quantum computing strategy long before other nations. I think, as ever, that leadership is in danger of being squandered when it comes to how do we start to commercialise it, how do we start to scale it now. So I think a focus on how we pull through and accelerate an advantage that we have had and I think still retain. And I also think biology, and specifically synthetic biology, are going to have profound effects that are hard to predict right now. But the idea that you are going to be able to increasingly design biological systems, adapt biological systems, and indeed combine those with in cyber-physical systems with the wider technological advances that we've talked about, is going to have profound impacts on our prosperity, our security, and how we all live in the future. It's an area that I was told consistently in government that we have real leadership in, and I'm now told, as I talk to people outside, that we are again not pulling through and in danger of losing as our pharmaceutical companies and others perhaps look elsewhere. So they're the areas I'd point to. I think biology is the one I know least about and therefore worry about the most. The other two, I think we could do an awful lot. We just need to understand the profundity of what they offer.
Thank you. And Hugh, the further you look back, the further forward you can see. So as a historian on the panel,
that'd be not true.
Conclude for us.
But 2 quick points. Intellectual rearmament, if that's Ed's phrase, I think is crucially important. That's really what we've come back to again and again. And I do think that's a sovereign capability. We lost sight of it. And we could do that, and it doesn't cost much. The other thing I would say is don't make sovereignty such an obsession that it gets in the way. The Scandinavian countries are now thinking about Scandinavia as a joint airspace interoperability. So they're maximising effects rather than separating effects. So there are areas, that's a capability more than, if you like, a deliverable in terms of the raw technologies. But the point here is that actually we're not going to be able to do it on our own if we're talking about a major war. That may be a low probability, and maybe a counter-terrorism thing may actually be the immediate issue that we have to confront. The sort of things we haven't talked about, what we would have talked about in this room 10 years ago or 20 years ago. The question we might have, and we haven't debated, is how far are you disabling yourself from dealing with some other issues that fall within the defence space, because you're looking at the biggest issue, and that was always the Cold War problem.
Thank you very much.
Right, brilliant. Well, I think that has been a very thought-provoking, fascinating, and indeed a sobering session on the nature of future warfare. And there has been a lot of ground covered in the last couple of hours. However, there will no doubt have been other areas which haven't. I would very much welcome, as I said to yourselves outside before we began our session, either collective or individual submissions from yourselves which you think could inform the work of the Defence Committee. Thank you so much to all of yourselves for lending your expertise to today's session. I'm sure that the wider British public will have gained a great deal from that, especially with regards to enhancing that national conversation. With that, I'll bring today's Defence Committee evidence session to an end. Order.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well done.